It's great to be invited to speak to the conference and this conference theme as well. And I'm very grateful for Peter for inviting me. But it's wonderful to speak to today's conference and today's theme as well. I think this theme is a fantastic theme. I'm really, really excited to be speaking about dilemmas. And I love the idea of dilemma and talking about digital dilemmas. So as Peter says, I have no answers, but it's really interesting to think about dilemma in terms of the digital, because it introduces these ideas about ambiguity and doubt and a difficult situation. And the idea that with digital education, everything is not okay. We're always told in terms of education technology over the past 30 years that this is a game changer and a revolution. We know now that's not the case. And I've been finding ways of being professionally concerned and disappointed and suspicious and possibly dismayed by digital technology for about 30 years now. I started in 1995. And it's great to talk about dilemmas. I also like to talk about distrust. I guess I like to think about digital technology as something that we can distrust. And this doesn't mean that we reject the idea of technology in education altogether. I think in 2022, rejecting the idea of technology is the same as rejecting having to eat food or breathe air. But the idea of distrust means that we can argue about the forms of technology that we think are preferable, or the forms of technology that we think we should be against. Particularly the idea that we can argue against the forms of technology that we're currently given. And this idea of distrust was suggested by me by an English literature professor. And she said, William Gibson has written some fantastic books. I distrust this particular flavor. And I love this idea. So I think this is a really healthy way to talk about digital education. It's great that you have a whole day, a whole conference to talk about dilemmas and distrust, what is wrong with technology, but also what we might want. Now, I've learned over the years that it's not very helpful to be completely dismissive of technology. And if you do have criticisms of technology, you often have to frame it in a very conciliatory way. And I've often used this idea of the wider picture, seeing the wider picture, glimpses of the wider picture. Sometimes I get a bit frustrated by having to be so balanced. And so I have written some papers where I'm a little bit more angry and possibly more honest about technology. I think I'm going to try and have a middle ground today. I won't be talking about bullshit, but I will be talking about distrust. So hopefully there's some things that I'll say today that will be of interest to you. There'll be some things that resonate, but you won't agree with everything I say. But hopefully even the things you don't agree with will get you thinking why you don't agree. And I think one of the things we all agree on is that education technology should be a space for discussion, a space for argument, a struggle, something that we can contest. This isn't a done deal. So I'm not going to argue that education technology is a complete disaster, but neither am I going to be particularly happy or optimistic. And I think actually there are 4 things that I want to try and do today. And I think these are 4 things that we might like to do during the day of the conference when we talk about dilemmas and distrust. I think we do need to be nuanced. Digital education is not good, bad, black or white. It's kind of gray. It's messy. It's entangled with all the non-digital or post-digital or the human. It's a big mess of things. We're not just talking about the technology. So we need to be nuanced here. We also need to be interested. And this is not the same as being uninterested. Clearly, you're all interested in technology. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. I don't think we need to be over-involved and too invested in technology being and you often find in discussions about digital education that a lot of people have a vested interest in something to sell. And if not, are actually commercially trying to sell you the technology, they are trying to sell the idea that technology is inherently a good thing. I think we need to step away and be slightly disinterested. On the same hand, it's really important to engage with the hype and what we might think as bad ideas. We can't just dismiss things and think, well, that's just a terrible idea. Clearly, that will never work. It's really interesting to think about why is it that people are talking so positively about technology that we might think is so obviously wrong. Nobody is stupid. but everyone is coming at the issue of digital technology from different perspectives, different places. And I love this idea of always thinking otherwise. It's really easy for me to criticize something without offering an alternative. So if we don't like the flavor of digital education that's currently on offer, then what do we want? And I think that's a really interesting and positive way, hopeful way to carry on these debates. So with these 4 principles in mind, what should we be making of the conference theme and the discussions that you're going to have over the rest of the day? And I had 2 things I wanted to argue, 2 areas of discussion. I have some good news and I have some bad news. Looking at your conference program, in one sense, I think there's possibly far less to be worried about than we might imagine. But in another sense, I think there's far more to be worried about than we might imagine. So I wanted to go through the 2 sides. And the first argument, as I said, is perhaps there's less to be worried about here than we might fear. And so looking at the schedule for today, you've got so much to do, so much to talk about. A lot of the digital dilemmas that you're discussing seem to me to relate to the big question that everyone is asking about technology, including Elon Musk. What does it mean to be human in the digital age? And in terms of education, I think this is kind of playing out with teachers reacting to kind of crappy technologies and worrying about the relational, the human aspects of their jobs. And this is what teachers do. Teachers are always concerned about relational, and teaching as a relational practice, and the human socio-emotional aspects of teaching and learning. And so I think the ongoing digitization of schools and colleges and universities raises a series of kind of existential dilemmas for teachers. How can we retain pedagogical integrity? How can we sustain generative social and emotional relations with online students? How can we continue to teach along creative or communal, inventive, and human-centered lines? And I think, as the subtitle of the conference infers, a lot of educators will understandably see these as didactic and pedagogical dilemmas. And again, this is what teachers do. This is what educators do. We see things in terms of pedagogy and didactics. And you're going to be tackling some really big questions during the day. Looking at the conference proceedings, I've cherry-picked some questions which come out from some of the abstracts and some of the descriptions. And these are fascinating dilemmas to be thinking about. How does digitization affect individual teachers' didactic scope for action and agency? How can we think about reflective practice and meaningful collaboration? I'm really interested in this discussion you're going to have about how overcoming the distance that occurs online between teachers and students. What does it mean when everything that we do is controlled by algorithms or shaped by algorithms? Reggae, I think, is going to talk later about seeing institutions and teaching in terms of poetic practice. And there's so much here to talk about. These are fascinating dilemmas, and they're complex and challenging questions. And this is definitely something that the second keynote, Vincent F. Hendricks, is going to be talking about when they speak. And again, there's some fascinating stuff here in terms of this really important question about autonomy and authority, and particularly in terms of autonomy, in terms of independent thinking. How can technology support our capacity for informed decision-making, informed action, the development of decent human beings? These are really, really important philosophical questions. And I'm really pleased that you're spending a whole day talking about them. But as I'm going to argue, I don't think we need to be too worried about these things in terms of everything being terror. I think we have answers to these questions. And so hopefully these can be really positive, kind of optimistic, hopeful discussions that you have. But these are important. And I've been thinking a little bit about these questions myself. And a lot of people are beginning to talk about these things outside of education. So when you're having these discussions, it's really interesting to relate to the broader literature. And actually, a few weeks ago, as I was putting this talk together, I came across a fascinating paper by Aidan van Noppen. They are really interesting. They were the technology advisor to the Obama White House. And it's fascinating that someone like Van Noppen is asking a lot of the same questions. How can we create technology worthy of the human spirit? And they point out in this paper that digital technologies are now the portals through which we live, love, learn, grieve, and connect with our communities. So I'm talking to you through Zoom. This is the same technology, the same platform that I was talking with my family with throughout the COVID pandemic in Europe. This is the same technology that we've attended virtual funerals. These are the same technologies that we've lived our lives through. So it's really important, if we're using these sorts of technologies, we have a responsibility as educators to ensure that these technologies are used in ways which treat the well-being of our students and us as teachers, teach the well-being of us as humans with due attention and care. And reading the Van Noppen paper, I was struck with thinking, so what would a humane education technology look like? Would it be a digital technology that's sensitive towards vulnerability, for example, the vulnerabilities of learning, the vulnerabilities of teaching, the anxieties of not knowing stuff, or the shame of being seen to publicly fail? Could we come up with digital education that, how can we have technology that evokes feelings of wonder, the joy of discovering things, and the complex feelings when you begin to feel connections to knowledge or understanding or other things that are larger than ourselves? I'm really interested in this idea of boredom and frustration and indignation and anger and the affective notion of learning, particularly when you're learning in a school. How can we have technologies that reflect all these things? These are all really important questions. I think you are going to be discussing these during the day, but it raises a whole bunch of really radical and quite challenging questions. How can we do this? How can we actually instill these values into the ways that we procure technology? The design briefs that we give the designers of technology and developers, how can we get these qualities into the technologies that we design and develop and buy? And actually, how can we change the conversations that politicians have, that policymakers have, that our leaders have about these types of technology and these types of issues? These are not issues that you hear many people talking about when it comes to digital education. However, as I was trying to argue, I think we have answers to these dilemmas. I think we have these things covered as an education community. And actually, some of the research we've been doing recently here in Melbourne is looking at the actual realities of how teachers and students in schools and also universities are actually engaging with the increased digitization of their everyday activities. And we're doing some research about how teachers and students are dealing with datafication and the idea of analytics in their classrooms. And in theory, this can be a very dehumanization of the classroom and this kind of dry, data-driven practice. But in reality, as you would imagine, we're finding that teachers and students are really adept at working around these platforms and systems, working around the barriers and the impediments of online education, exercising discretion. And there's some really hopeful things coming out of this research and other research looking at classroom use of technology that shows how schools and universities are very resilient places. What Larry Cuban refers to as the grammars of schooling are still shaping these emerging technologies in ways that mean that a lot of the values that schools and universities have long been built around persist. We're also finding a lot of really interesting findings in terms of how teachers are able to exercise discretion and use technologies in ways which retain their decision-making, their autonomy, their relations with students. And I like this idea of teachers as street-level bureaucrats. Well, we're finding what Ali Akhtaib refers to as street-level algorithms. Teachers are very important I can't even say the word, kind of intermediaries between the technology and the way the students are experiencing education. And a lot of relational work is being put to how teachers can use digital technologies. And we're also finding that students are very resilient, resistant, creative, strategic, stoic in the way that they engage with technologies. And so all told, I think there's a lot that we're finding in our own research, and there's a lot that we're actually finding in the literature, which suggests that teachers and students are able to exercise some level of discretion in being human or more than human when they engage with digital technologies. And so I think when we're having these discussions, if we look beyond the usual discourse that you hear at a huge education technology show like SET or BET, then I think as an education community, we have a playbook for how we can teach and learn on digitally in a way that is humane. And I love the work that's going on at Edinburgh University, for example, in terms of their manifesto for teaching online. If you've not read this, it's really, really worth engaging with in terms of how we can think otherwise about teaching and learning with technologies in ways which are public and risky and multi-voiced and socio-material and messy and open and all the things I think that you're interested in today. The Hybrid Pedagogy Collective has been another great source of inspiration, as had things like the Collected Learning Network. And then again, if you look at open education resources, movements like design justice, feminist ed tech, there's so much here, I think. There's so many people who are already dealing with these dilemmas that we know what we should be doing. So in some ways, this section of the conference, I think, should be celebratory. These are not dilemmas that we cannot face. I think these are just clear choices that the education community, and particularly those of us who are in leadership or management positions, need to be brave enough to take. The main dilemma here is not what should we be doing, but how do we get more people to do it? So I think this is a source of optimism. As long as we have schools and universities as places where people come together to learn, then I think we might be okay. The relational and the human aspects of classroom education will win out. I think teachers can cope. Teachers can work around the systems as they already have. Teachers have always been good at working around the systems. Students are always more knowing and tactical than we give them credit for. So I think as long as there's a human in the loop, to use a technology phrase, and as long as that human is a caring, careful, expert professional, then we might be okay, because this is what teachers do. So in some ways, we just need to allow teachers and students, we need to trust them and give them the opportunity to engage in these different ways of doing technology. So that's my hopeful half of the talk. But then I flip to my less hopeful task of the talk. My worry is, and I think the big dilemma is that technology might be, and digital education might be leading to the end of schools as face-to-face places where people come together, as universities where people can actually have the time and space to engage in these more relational social practices. And as Peter was saying in terms of the book, should robots replace teachers? My worry is that the expert professional teacher is under threat from the technology. So in this sense, there's perhaps more to be worried about than we might fear. So the concern here, I think, is that far-reaching digital structures and arrangements and dependencies are beginning to be put into place around us. Perhaps we're not aware of it, but things are actually happening behind the scenes. And I think these forms of digital education threaten the hollowing out of what we currently take for granted as public education. And I think these are the issues that we also need to be talking about, but I don't think we know what to do about them at the moment. We don't have a playbook. This involves engaging with issues of political economy, engaging with the politics of digital education, developing a sense of solidarity, as Peter was saying, around digital education. And at the moment, I'm concerned this isn't what teachers are doing. It's interesting you mentioned Elon Musk. I really like Twitter. Twitter is a fantastic place for me. I learn so much. I don't follow many people. I don't tweet a huge amount, but so much scholarship and sharing. I really hope it stays as a place for public debate around education. And Thomas Hillman from Gothenburg University tweeted something last month, which really got me thinking. You might think this sounds very banal, but to me, this was a really, really interesting thing that he says. And he's talking about the platformitization of education. And he was saying the big difference is that the center of coordination is shifting. And we've moved from technology in classrooms to classrooms in technology. Now, for me, that was really, really interesting to think about what he was talking about here. If you think about the shifts that we've endured during the pandemic, we've migrated to Zoom and to Moodle and to Canvas and to all of these other platforms. But it's not just doing the same thing in a different setting. I think it's a completely different context within which education now takes place. And I think what Tom is arguing here is that we need to talk seriously about platformitization and what this actually means. Datafication, automation, taking students and teachers and classrooms away from their institution, away from their local social settings, and putting them into a completely different setting, context, and world, which is fundamentally shaped and owned and governed by the big tech corporations, the software developers, the marketeers that are responsible for these platforms. So this is one of the dilemmas I think we have. How do we make sense of platform education in Jose van Dijk's terms? And it's interesting to think, if we read Van Dijk again and think about the educational shifts that we've endured over the past 2 years of the pandemic, what's actually taken place. These platforms, I think, are not just neutral places where we can carry on teaching and learning like we already have. These are really important intermediary architectures that mesh with lots of other intermediary architectures. So it's really interesting to think about how something like Zoom connects us to Google Classroom and Moodle and all sorts of other platforms all mesh together, but also underpinning infrastructures like AWS and Microsoft Cloud Services. We're in this kind of platform ecology or ecosystem when we go on to something like Zoom. Even as I'm speaking to you, everything I say is going to millions of different data centers all around the world. The data is being extracted. There are all sorts of stuff going on here. It's also interesting to think about then the generation and capture and processing of data and the automations which are then baked into these systems. So, as I say, I think this is a fundamentally different way of teaching and learning, which takes us away from the local school and the local classroom or the local university, where the human and the relational and the socio-emotional aspects of teaching and learning take place. And one of the things that Van Dijk and a lot of other scholars like Tom Hillman are now showing us is that these forms of digital education are based around fundamentally different logics. And these are logics which are beginning to shape the flavors of digital education that we actually have in our everyday lives. This is the idea that education, for example, can be calculated, can be controlled and modeled in a way that is like a system that can be run efficiently and effectively, almost a programmable form of education. And students and teachers and other people are framed and positioned as individual users or even consumers that operate wholly within a digital ecosystem. And that education is something that's scalable. Education is something that can happen at scale and or can be plugged in on a modular basis. So everything fits into everything else. And so it's this really seductive logic for many politicians, policymakers, educational leaders, that we can have more fluid forms of education. We can have more personalized forms of education, that every individual is agentic and can self-determine the types of educational experience that they have at any time. They can self-regulate what they do. This idea of the flexible and fluid, agile, responsive learner, and then the idea that educators and educational institutions need to be equally responsive to what the individual wants. These are very, very different things than everyone getting together in a classroom. And for lots of people, this is seen as a very positive thing. This is a great new revolution in education. My concern is it's a harmful thing. And I think we really need to talk about the harms, possibly more than the dilemmas or the problems or the compromises. I think, and research is telling us, that these are forms of digital education that harm people and often harm people who are already most marginalized. So we need to think about the harms that are associated with this idea that education is now a product that can be consumed as a service. That education is something that feeds into the data economy, or what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism. And I think we need to ask really serious questions about the profound unfairness of this, the way that these forms of education ignore structural inequalities, for example, or perhaps even exacerbate existing disadvantages. We're beginning to talk about some of these issues in terms of ethics, for example, or transparency. But I think we need to really talk seriously about accountability, bias, surveillance, dehumanization, the de-skilling of professional educators. All these things, I think, are really, really important and relate to this class of logics. And I think the fundamental incompatibility here is the values and the norms and the understandings that underpin the flavors of platform education and digital education that we're currently plugged into, against the established values, norms, and understandings that underpin what we might see as traditional education or collective education or public education. It's almost an ontological clash between how big tech and software designers and, organizations like Pearson and OECD and these kind of corporate education reformers see education, as against how maybe many teachers and many people in the room see education. My guess is that many people in the room would argue perhaps education is not completely calculable, controllable. It's not a system that we can run efficiently and effectively if we have better data or we have better automations. Students and teachers are not individual users. I like Ruba Benjamin's argument that users get used. We should stop talking about users. We should talk about people. We're not users that operate within a digital education ecosystem. And that a lot of what we do in education is not scalable. There is no one-size-fits-all solution to this. We can't just plug in and out. Education is much more, it is far more complex than that. And I think these are the reasons why digital education feels uncomfortable, unsettling, non-human. It's not just down to the individual. It's also down to the kind of the structures that we're working within. My concern then is that there are two ways this might play out. And I think these are things that we need to talk about. If you believe the hype, if you believe the enthusiasts for the new digital education revolution, then this will be a transformation. There's a lot of belief that these forms of digital education will lead to a corporate reform of education. Educational institutions will be run along tech-based, business-like lines, and we will have a completely new form of education. This is my concern. My concern actually is this won't happen, and we will have, rather than transformation or revolution, we'll have just a state of attrition. I don't believe that digital education will completely win or disrupt or transform or revolutionize education. Schools and universities and teachers and educators and students are remarkably resilient places. But trying to put this digital education framework over our existing education system, I think, will cause problems and breakdowns and tensions between these two logics. And so I think likely we're going to see the worst of both worlds. And this leads me on to what I think is one of the big dilemmas that we need to talk about. You very rarely hear people talk about this when they talk about digital education, is that a lot of these systems and platforms and emerging technologies that we're currently being sold and are currently being pushed into our everyday practice do not work. Does not work in the manner that's been promised. If you look at the hype around AI or automation technologies, personalized learning systems, online exam proctoring, this is technology that does not work. And this, I think, is going to be the big problem of the 2020s. Actually, one of the pushbacks that you often get when you talk about emerging technologies with educators is that, oh, this is all rubbish. This can never happen. This will never work. I think they're quite right. But I think that's the problem. So when we are told about technologies that can measure the motivation of students or gauge their attention or how bored they are or how well they're learning, of course that can't work. We know that. But as Adam Greenfield says, the problem isn't that whether the questions work or not as advertised, it's whether somebody believes that the technology does work and then acts on that. And I think more and more in education, our leaders, our policymakers believe that these big systems can maybe save money or be more effective or be more efficient. And these technologies are being rolled out anyway into our educational settings. And this is the big dilemma. Because when these technologies don't work in the way that we are expecting, it causes problems. Anything that breaks down or is glitch is very, very harmful when you've got rid of the pre-technology ways of doing the thing that they're supposed to be doing. So when you've stopped employing school counselors, for example, because you now have a chatbot and the chatbot doesn't work, you have a problem. When you've got rid of all the books in the library because you now have a subscription to Epic Books or another platform, you have a problem. And I think the technology not working, we need to talk much more seriously about what happens when the technologies we have in our educational settings fail, when they break down. Either it causes a lot of work for educators to try and pick up the pieces, or it impacts on teachers and students, and particularly impacts on already disadvantaged teachers and students. So this, I think, is a really interesting question. Why do we continue to talk about these platforms and these new systems and these emerging technologies as capable of actually working in the ways that those of the people who are selling it to us would like us to believe? This is a really interesting but also important question to ask. And there are many reasons you might come up with. Clearly, on one hand, we have big tech companies that are trying to sell us these systems to make a profit. But also we have education managers and administrators who are buying these systems in a way of trying to make education more efficient or standardized or controllable. And that's a really important thing to think about as well. A lot of the technologies that we might not be happy with are not actually being sold to teachers or students. Teachers and students are not the intended end users or intended consumers of these technologies. These technologies are being sold to educational institutions, to managers, to administrators. And the motivations of educational managers and administrators and institutions are very different to teachers and students. That's one thing to think about when you're moaning that the software you're working doesn't work for you. Maybe it's not intended to work for you. It's actually intended to work for an institutional purposes rather than instructional purposes. But also, I think this is going to need to take seriously this idea that a lot of these technologies ideologically are trying to change the nature of education around these lines of corporate reform, or what sometimes people refer to as the neoliberal form of education. This idea that education problems can be solved through kind of marketplaces and market logics and kind of individualization and all of these kind of values, I think, are baked into lots of these systems. So I think we need to push back. I think we need to think about solidarity. We need to think about arguments. We need to think about who should take responsibility for raising these issues and perhaps thinking otherwise. Now, the responsibility normally falls on the education community. I think unfairly. It's always kind of falling to teachers and other education professionals. But there is something to think about this. How can we mobilize teachers and other educators and other people in the education system to talk about these issues, to actually kind of discuss these issues, to kind of think about alternatives? I think one way forward is teaching unions. A lot of what I've just said is technology as a workplace issue. It's not about teaching, it's about teaching as work. So I think teaching unions are slowly beginning to take these issues on board, but we certainly need to give them more support. There's a really interesting question to ask here about regulation and regulators. Valislava Hillman in London, for example, has raised the provocative argument: should digital education firms require a license to practice before they're allowed to actually sell their products to educators? Alternatively, we could argue that we should have education technology regulators, like regulatory agencies like drug regulation agencies. Or alternatively, existing regulators should actually just become more savvy about technology and begin to apply their forms of regulation. But there's certainly a debate to have here. There's also a debate to have about the role of the government and the state. We know over the past 10, 20 years that governments and states have withdrawn from digital education and left it very much up to individual institutions or school districts to fend for themselves. And there's a kind of Wild West situation at the moment where individual schools and universities are having to make sense of this for themselves. And I think it's really interesting as well to think about the wider public, or publics in plural, in terms of making these issues about digital education open and democratic. The past 2 years, for example, have seen a whole generation of parents suddenly have very, very strong ideas about digital education and the role of technology in schooling. Those of us that have had to put up with online schooling during COVID. So we've got this moment where we can actually possibly mobilize public opinion. And last of all, working with the commercial and the corporate actors in this space. The big tech actors that I've talked about, the Amazons and the Googles and the Microsofts and the Elon Musks of the world. But also this idea that a lot of education technology is actually run by very small, very inexperienced, small tech companies. This is not just something that Amazon and Google have to get right. This is something that we have to support small companies. And I think if everyone that I've just talked about engages with these issues, then perhaps we can begin to make education technology and digital education a political matter, a matter of struggle, a matter of discussion, a matter of debate. My concern is, though, that this is not what teachers normally do. We like to talk about didactics and pedagogy, and we like to talk about what goes on in the classroom. I think, not maybe today, but maybe at future conferences, we need to think beyond the classroom. And that's kind of what I meant by the wider picture. So I hope today you can celebrate all of the alternative, more human, more emotional, more humane ways of technology use that we know we can do. We know what we should be doing here, but we might find some time to think about these bigger issues. And these are not just issues that face education. These are issues that face all aspects of society. Everyone is trying to deal with the creeping power of corporations and big tech industry. Everyone is worried about the hollowing out of public services through technology, the Uberification and the Netflixization of everything. Hospitals, social welfare, governments is taking place. So this is not just a thing that educators have to worry about on their own. But I do think there are specific things taking place in education that educational people like ourselves are best placed to start talking about. So my big challenge, my big question is, how can we work to raise a collective consciousness of these more political issues, develop a sense of solidarity and resistance around what we don't like, the flavors of digital education that we're not happy with, and perhaps work together to establish alternate forms and alternate flavors that are preferable, that are based around different sets of values and agendas, which perhaps do fit us more as educators. Resistance is possible, and I am really heartened to see some unions and even some students beginning to protest against some of the worst forms of digital education. And I think these are things which we need to pursue. Education International, for example, have been raising some really interesting challenges to the creep of AI, for example, and personalized learning into education. We need to do more of this. We need to kind of become angry as well as enthusiastic about technology. And so I just wanted to finish with a few concluding thoughts. And if there's time for questions or comments, then feel free to talk into the microphone. I do think a lot of what we're talking about today is a kind of existential challenge. It's an ontological tension that we can't easily overcome, this tension between the values and the norms of digital education as opposed to what we might want to call traditional education. I think a lot of the most insidious harms we won't notice. I think a lot of the most important technologies to be talking about now are not technologies that we use, that teachers and students use, but are actually technologies that are used on teachers and students. The algorithmic, the automated, the AI technologies that take place in the background, monitoring and data, all of this stuff. I think we need to think about how technology exacerbates existing harms, but also introduces new harms. I've not mentioned it, but I'm really interested and worried about the environmental and ecological aspects of digital education and the ways that the products we use are linked with the exploitation of very cheap outsourced labor from the global south. As I said before, I don't think we need to talk about all of these emerging technologies working. We need to talk about them not working and the problems that causes. These are not new problems. A lot of what I've talked about, we do have responses to. This isn't the first time we've talked about privatization of education or the de-skilling of teachers. And I don't want to get across the idea that we need to be opposed to the idea of digital education. If anything, I'm opposed to the industry of digital education. And perhaps one thing I think you're going to talk about this today, but I don't think we need to say that design is the answer. Design will save us. These dilemmas are not solely a matter of designing better technology. I think in many ways, a lot of these problems will come from better education systems, better societies. These are not dilemmas we can fix, but these are certainly things we can address. So anyway, lots of thoughts, no solutions, no answers, as Peter says, and it's not been completely coherent, but hopefully there's been something I've said today that will get you started for the rest of the day and hopefully stimulate some interesting conversations. So thank you very much. And if there is any time, I'd love to hear any comments or feedback that you have. Thanks.